colleague of mine in San Antonio. And this is his story, his words here, and I'm just quoting. Bill was a retired pastor who helped out now and then in our church in San Antonio. He was a huge man, the image of what you think of as a lean, tall Texan. He was a man with a huge heart. Everyone talked about Bill and what a wonderful pastor he was. Bill died a couple of months before I started working at the church, so I only got to know his wife, Mary. I heard so many things about Bill, what a generous man he was, how funny he was, how gentle he was, but I never heard much about Mary. But it soon came to my attention that Mary seemed to be everywhere. I would visit folks in the hospital, and whoever I was visiting would inevitably say, "Oh, Mary says hello. She was just here a few minutes ago." It was amazing. Even if I received a call on my cell phone and drove directly to the ER, almost without fail, Mary had already been there, and it got to the point where I would speed and take shortcuts to see if I could get to the hospital first. One day, to my surprise, I arrived 10 minutes ahead of Mary. Victory. So I asked around and found out that Mary and her visiting was not new. Mary had always been quietly visiting people. I figured she had started this visiting after her husband died, but no, she had always visited people. Salute. Even when she even arrived at the hospital before her pastor husband when he was alive. So what was Mary doing in all these visits? Mary was just didn't say hello to all of those she visited. She spent most of the time praying, and she was quietly praying for those who would come next. She was preparing the way for the pastors, praying that their visit would be effective and that those in the hospital room would be open to the Holy Spirit. I often wondered, was Pastor Bill so successful because he was such a great guy? Or was Pastor Bill successful because Mary went before him in ministry? It's a good thought. And actually, this is not just one of those stories that people tell, it's a sermon fodder, okay? This is not sermon fodder. That's a real live person, Mary Burdett Arnold. And one of these days I'm going to look up and see if she's kin to another good friend of mine who is a Burdett. And I worked with him in the oil field, so could be. So here in our passage today, this is the first thing we see God telling Bnei Israel. He will go before them in the land and prepare the way before them. We need to know that God will go before us like he went before Israel, and he will prepare a way ahead of us. The second thing we see in this passage, and I think the more powerful concept, is that God has a drawn out or extended plan for spiritual growth, for our spiritual growth. We don't become spiritually mature overnight. Maturity takes a long time, and it's supposed to. I've seen times where, especially when I was younger, some guy would get miraculously saved. But this was when I was growing up. It was like the gang leaders, and the what was the guy with the knife and the cross and the switchblade? What was the guy? Nicky Cruz was the name, and he got saved. Well, guess what? They had that guy up preaching in a year. Well, that to me. I looked at that and I said, this is not right. I mean, even somebody as learned and who had studied Torah all his life, when he had his experience with Yeshua on the Damascus Road, he went and studied 3 more years before he went on the missionary field. And that was Paul, the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul. He took that time to prepare. So many times we get discouraged or frustrated in our spiritual walk, but God has created a long-term plan for our spiritual growth. It is a life of discipleship and not a brief correspondence course. This is not something that you can hit YouTube online and then all of a sudden you're you're an expert. Bottom line, there are no shortcuts to spiritual maturity. These two ideas go hand in hand so that we may have a successful life following Hashem. Going before us, long-term plan, okay? Long-term plan. This is not a spiritual get-rich-quick plan, okay? It doesn't work that way. The people of Israel had been taken out of captivity. They had brought out into the desert. God had established a relationship with them, and had established this relationship through the giving of the Ten Commandments. Remember, last week when we were in the Parsha Yitro, which was the one where we get the Ten Commandments, we saw that the Ten Commandments were relational in nature and not just a list of do's and don'ts. God had asked them, will you do this? And they said, yes, we will do that. A covenant. So now God, having established a relationship with his people, he prepares them for the entrance into the land that he's promised them. Now, just facing the facts, Israel was a people who in no way were able to move into the land and that they were headed for. Just coming out of slavery and then going up to Mount Sinai, and then a month or so later on, well, actually, it would by the time they got the tabernacle built and everything, so they'd been out of slavery a year, and they were still not ready to go in and take the promised land. It was not that easy. The Egyptians had tried, actually, they had invaded Canaan several times in the preceding years, and every time they had been rebuffed. They had gotten beat. The Philistines had beaten them. The Phoenicians had beaten them. And Egypt had the strongest army in the world at that time, and yet they could not conquer Canaan. It's just, that was a fact. And even after all of those efforts, the Egyptian military was just not strong enough. But what they did, with Israel coming up against them, if Egypt couldn't beat the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and all of those kind of ites, Israel didn't have much of a chance at all. Now, but all of these facts actually are irrelevant. You can do all the facts you want to. Because why? Because God was going before them. In verse 20, we see that it doesn't really matter who stands before the Hebrews, because God is sending an angel before them. Look at verse 20. What's the purpose of the angel? It said to guard you and bring you to the place I've prepared. Well, what's this angel guarding them from? First, I think all kinds of physical danger, wars and so forth. He's guarding them from all kinds of calamity. But second, the people who are entering an area where evil has reigned supreme, he's guarding them from those people. Not only were the societies that inhabited the land ahead of them pagan through and through, their pagan practices were especially they're just horrible practices that they had. They tolerated and encouraged extreme physical and sexual abuse of people. And, in my Sunday night classes, if any of you some of you are on the Sunday night classes, I've talked about the gods Baal, the gods of Canaan. And it's almost impossible to describe the abusive worship of the Canaanites in polite company. Okay, let me just say that common everyday rituals in their society would be considered crimes in our society, deserving of a life sentence and maybe even a death sentence, because they did all sorts of things, human sacrifices and so forth. See, there was an evil that just permeated the land before the Israelites got there, and it was more than just a physical danger that lay ahead. It was a spiritual danger also. Now, notice that the angel's name was not given. The picture in the slide here is supposed to be of Michael, the archangel, which is kind of gives us a visual interpretation of what a mysterious angel of Adonai may have looked like. In fact, if you look at the Jewish literature that is describing this, from everyone from Rashi on down to Rambam and Kizkuni and many of the others, they described this angel as they said that would have been the archangel Michael. All right. Now, But nowhere in verse 20 to 23 do we see the name of the angel. Only the Lord's name is mentioned. Well, so why is that? Well, names are considered powerful by the ancient people. So was the angel the one that was the powerful one? No, it was the Lord that was the powerful one. The angel was it was called he was just a messenger, a shalach. That's a servant, and Melech, and that's Malach. He was a one that was sent out. And so only God's name is mentioned because we should place our trust in him and not the messenger. So I want to be clear here now. I believe that the angel that is mentioned here was a pre-incarnate visitation by Yeshua and was seen again by Joshua before the Battle of Jericho. Remember, he saw this guy and he says, who are you? And he says, I'm the captain of the host of God's army, captain of the host. And so who could that have been but Yeshua? The angel has power because he was the Son of God. It is interesting that the ancient Jewish philosopher Philo had this comment about verse 20. God, now this is Philo, Jewish, now he was in Alexandria, and not a believer, as we know it. God, as the shepherd and king, conducts all things according to law and righteousness, having established over them his right word, his only begotten Son, who, as the viceroy of the great king, takes care of and ministers to his sacred flock, to this sacred flock. For it is somewhere said in that Exodus 23:20, behold, I am, and I will send my angel before thy face to keep thee in the way. Incredibly, Philo, who's not a believer, he equated this angel to the Son of God. Now that to me is just an incredible thing. As I said before, there's really very, very little chance of success for the Israelites in their venture into the land of Canaan. The outlook would have been impossible, and we see this in this is why we see in verse 21. It says they were not to rebel against the angel. His leading his Israel would be successful, and this advanced angel, he was going to go before them, and they had to stay with him because he was capable and they were not. Now we see the same in our lives. God goes before us, and in situations that are impossible, situations where we are incapable of securing a good outcome. That happens to me quite often. We have to literally step back and let God go before us. Now, this is the thing that happens all the time in all of our lives, one time or another, if you just recognize it. In the past 6 months, I have worked with several people in this congregation who have had very frustrating, very difficult, very serious situations before them. Like Israel, in each and every one of these situations in this congregation here, God was leading and guiding us all along the way. And in the Bible, we see that Israel fighting hard to advance in the land. They work hard, they sweat, they are wounded, and many even die. It is not easy. It does not happen overnight. Yet the impossible is accomplished. Why? Because the Lord has gone before them. He was there. He had his angel before them. And the situation that cannot happen or should not happen actually happens. When we see that God goes before us, that does not mean that everything is ready and waiting for us to walk in and sit down. No, God goes before us and creates a situation where we can succeed. Then there's a lot of work to do ahead of us. Okay? I'm not going to be one that tells you that once you accept the Lord as your Savior, then you're on easy street. Everything is just going to fall into place because you deserve that. Well, no, that's you'll never hear that from me. Okay? You only deserve it after you work your tuchus off and do what God tells you to do. And that's when you might deserve something is after you've earned it. One thing that we note as we move further along with the Hebrews in their journey is that especially Moses prays as the people move forward. He was a praying man. This is no coincidence. And we should follow that model in our own lives. For with us, without praying for a situation that is before us, how can we expect God's direction? I'd like to point out, though, in verse 28, now we see an odd verse here where God says that he will send the hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites out of your way. Now, this verse is kind of a pun in Hebrew because it's a play on the words of Zerah and Misaim. And so basically when you're putting the two side by side, like I said, you'd have to look at it in Hebrew and it would be a pun, but it doesn't translate well. So I'll just say that, it reflects that God's use of the armies of Egypt to attack Canaan. Okay, Egypt didn't take over Canaan. They did not conquer it. They were not the force that Israel had to deal with going into Canaan. But what Egypt did, as a hornet, he went in there and Egypt kind of softened up the enemy a bit, reduced the size of their armies, and maybe tore down some city walls that weren't rebuilt before Israel got there. So he weakened their military before the Hebrews even arrived. So it's ironic that the very people who held the Hebrews captive for so many years were the ones who actually made it more likely that the Hebrews could capture that promised land. And so sometimes, God works very, very strangely. Now, the second powerful thing that we see in this passage combines with the first in an effective formula for spiritual development in our lives. In verse 29 and 30. Notice that God will not drive out the enemy in a single year, but that he will drive them out little by little. A lot of times, in our world today, we get frustrated when things don't happen right away. How often do we punch that button on the computer and then you get the little circle of death going round and round and round? So what do? Like that. And I live with a woman that's like that. When it doesn't hit the first time and she's, and then gets frustrated with me because I can't undo her, hitting that thing 20 times, then all of a sudden she's got 20 screens pop up then when it actually does. And it's happened to all of us. We get frustrated with those things. We want instant results. Even in our searches that used to, when you had to research something before in the day before computers, that's BC. Okay, in the days BC before computers, what did you have to do? You had to go to the library and you would do this thing that was any of you are still familiar with the old Dewey Decimal System? Sure you are. And the card catalogs. Okay, now that really dates us, doesn't it? And if you said that to our kids nowadays, they'd say, huh? A decimal system? What's that? Math or something? And it would take you. You'd go and look up things in in dictionaries and encyclopedias. And growing up, my dad had bought us the Encyclopedia Britannica because he wanted us to have the best there was. And other people said no, it was the Funkin' Wagnalls or the World Book or different ones. Dictionaries and encyclopedias, but it took a long time to get to the point that nowadays you hit, you type in there on Rabbi Google and it pops up with an answer for you, and so we get used to that. But God said, no, I'm going to drive out these people little by little, just little by little. Why? He said, because if I don't, you come in there, you don't have enough people right now to totally populate the land. It'll be overrun by wild animals. And then you'll really have a problem, So it's kind of hard for us to imagine, wild animals. but actually lions and so forth were evident in Israel for a long time after even after the time of Yeshua. There were still lions and wild animals living, dangerous wild animals living in Israel. So there again, that was one of the provisions of God, moving slowly so that the people would be protected from the wild animals. And in Joshua 24, we see that the promised plague of hornets actually became a literal plague of hornets for the people who occupied those lands. If you look in Joshua 24, 11, and 12, then you crossed over the Jordan and came to Jericho, but the men of Jericho fought against you, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, but I delivered them into your hand. Then I sent the hornet before you, and it drove them from out before you. And the two kings of the Amorites, not by your sword or by your bow. Can you imagine? God sent hordes of hornets, actual hornets, there, and drove the enemy away because, a brave man can stand up there with his sword and, he can fight and everything. But those little bitty bugs, okay. So I can tell you a little story. Last night, last night, getting out of the shower, and I'm drying off, and I felt something funny on my neck, in the towel, and so I looked in the mirror, and there's a great big old red wasp right there on my neck. Okay, so I did a dance. I tell you what, getting away from that thing, because one thing I'm deathly allergic to wasp stings. Okay, one up there like that, and right in my neck, close to my brain, it would not have ended well. But anyway, there's a wasp. So you can be brave about lots of things. I am not brave about wasps. Okay, no way. And you send in a horde of wasps, and I guarantee you, it will make the enemy run, no matter who the enemy is. And so God was very deliberate in his slow migration of Israel's, the slow migration of B'nai Israel's enemies, taking enough time that the Hebrews were able to grow and get bigger and take the land. And so I guess in a way, that's an example. There is an example in modern history, where the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Now that area there, nobody lives there, nobody goes in there because it's the demilitarized zone. So they say that the wildlife in that little zone between the two countries has just proliferated. That it's just a wonderful variety and diversity of wildlife, because basically there's no humans and it's left alone. So this would have been, if Israel had gone through there and all of the bad guys had left, and Israel not big enough and populous enough to fulfill it, then they would have had problems with the animals. So we're beginning to see that the spiritual development of our lives in many ways follows the developments of the Hebrews after they leave Egypt. Now here's a point that we see this again. We become messianic believers, and we want everything at once. We want to be mature overnight. We perceive others to be strong and mature in their faith, and we desire to be like they are, but we don't ever seem to arrive. Now, there are many issues and reasons why we don't, or why we may be stalled in our spiritual development. Sometimes we're not actually stalled, but many times we're just not going as fast as we desire them to. We become frustrated. We become worried, and we're not growing like we should. Sometimes people resort to faking it, putting on appearances that they have had it all put together before the Lord. And I'm sure you've seen that kind of phenomenon before, that somebody is, and my goodness, I see it every once, well, probably more often than you do. Somebody will email me, text me, or something like that they're wanting to, or on our websites, they will put something down on our website, and it looks kind of complex, and you look at it and you go, oh wow, what is this person trying to say? And basically, it's just a bunch of gobbledygook that they've put together from cut and paste and using a lot of high sounding Hebrew words that are not really in place and in the right spot, and instead of just using the word God in where they're saying it, then they'll use some kind of like a contraction of all sorts of 5 or 6 different Hebrew words that is a name of God, but they put them all together so that makes them sound more spiritual and more with it. So when I get those kind of things on our website, and I look at them and I said, I can't even figure out what this guy is saying, then I just go boop and delete it because it's confusing. It confuses me. I don't know what they're saying, and I don't want him confusing anybody else. But you see that all the time. People taking on things that they really have no business doing. And so it's just one of those kind of things. But it takes time. Now, we don't, things don't happen to us right away. God allows us to move forward only as far as, then he'll go ahead of us a little bit, and then he waits for us to catch up. He doesn't get so far away that, that pillar of fire and that pillar of that cloud, the pillar of cloud there, it didn't get so far away that the Israelites look around and became like that tribe out there in the imaginary Wild West, where the heck are we? They never got lost because God was always with them. He was just far enough ahead. They knew where they were going to go. And so God established a relationship. It goes back to this one word, relationship. And now it may surprise you that, to see that the 10 Commandments, it's more than about a relationship than anything else. It's not just a bunch of mishpatim, okay, which is our parsha. It's not just a bunch of regulations, but it's about our spiritual growth, and that's what our relationship is about more than anything else. Earlier, I spoke of God going before us and providing successful situations in our lives, but success is not the end that God has in mind for us. Success is not the end that God has in mind for us. When we stand before God in heaven and say that we've had a long string of successes that God walked us through, don't think he will be impressed. Rather, it will be far better to stand before God without a single success, a single victory, but a strong relationship with him. I've seen missionaries who spent their entire life on the mission field, and they could not count a handful of people that ever got saved in their ministry, and yet they were faithful. They were faithful. You think this long, extensive campaign to conquer the land of Palestine, of Israel, Canaan, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, was a simple land issue? Now, the borders given to the for Israel that they would fulfill, they've actually never ever fulfilled those borders. They never did, go reach out there and fill up where God told them. Now that's going to be something probably in the millennium that Israel will take that. But the closest they ever got was under David and Solomon, and that was about it. So this whole extensive campaign that the Hebrews were embarking on was about relationship. It wasn't so much about land. They were to learn and become closer to the Lord with every encounter. They were to come to trust in the Lord no matter what the circumstances were, no matter what what was happening, no matter. Didn't matter. This is the same for us. God moves us along, sometimes very slowly at times, and that because there are difficult situations that come to us. Every once in a while, something will come up against you and you say, it's just too much for me. But God put, a little bit ahead of us. He's just right there. And, we got crazy relationship, crazy situations, roadblocks. We talked about roadblocks in the last couple of weeks. And They're very important with our relationship with Yeshua. And that's the thing. The relationship is much more important than whether you can get to the end of the road and say, see, I've done it. Have you ever considered this? The difficult or the crazy situation that you're in right now could be God's definition of what is success. Could be God's definition of what is success be different. I took out a word there. Could it be God's definition of what is success? Could be different than what we see as success? What do we gain if we gain the whole world and yet we don't know God? Remember that verse? So now we finally, why did he want us to displace those people? Why did he say, get rid of those people out of Israel? Have you ever thought about that? Somebody else, talk about that. And so why didn't he just allow the Hebrews, the Israelites, to come in there, conquer the people, and then say, well, no, okay, that's okay. You can live here. Just, we'll be your bosses, and you will be the masters. And no, there's this thing called, assimilation. Assimilation is one of the most dangerous things that ever faced Israel. One of the most dangerous things that faces them today. And that tolerance of evil becomes the assimilation of it. These people were to be displaced or killed to prevent their influence on the Hebrews as they would entice. And we saw in history that that's what they did. They enticed the Israelites to take on their gods. Okay? Why? Because, the mishpatim, the laws of God were, in some cases, they're pretty dry. They're pretty dry. But these pagan religions, they had this time year where, the men could go around running around naked with a bunch of naked women. And so, that seemed a lot more attractive to the Israelite men than God saying, no, you're not to be running around like that. You're supposed to be, faithful to your wife and all of that kind of stuff. Oh, boring. But that's the way God said that he wanted it. And so, sure, that other religion seemed a little bit more enticing. We see today things that are very, very, very enticing. And that's what happened to Israel. They got enticed. We see in our lives, we become believers. The Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit comes on us. And as Paul says, we are now to live a life in the Spirit. We are new beings in Messiah, but our old self is still very, very active. It's still very much with us. Even Paul said that. And slowly over time, we are to learn the life of the Spirit and eliminate the old life we had. Because if we do not move this old life away, it'll come back to us in the bad habits, the sins, the vulgar language, the selfishness. And all these things, they just come back if you don't stay with the Lord and follow him as he goes ahead of us. If we don't displace those, how do we displace those? We displace that with the Holy Spirit, with reading the Word, with prayer, meditation, being with other believers, with your fellow believers. God promises to go before us. And if God goes before us, the impossible then can become possible. Yet I want us to very seriously consider our version of success. What is our version of success? And see the true success of any life of a believer is a close relationship with Yeshua. All other achievements pale in comparison. In the end, God does not call us to be successful. He calls us to be faithful. The wide path, that wide path, it allows too much room to wander. Actually, if you ever, on a big old highway, that's 3 or 4 lanes wide, and you're going on there, you don't have to be and especially if there's no other cars around, you could kind of wander into this lane and wander into that lane and this, and that's okay. But if you're on a highway which is only just narrow, wide enough, right now on I-10, we see a lot of these Jersey barriers, and it looks like that the road is, you got the road, and then you got these concrete barriers right there, and so I have to be very careful, and especially when I used to pull my camper a lot, that going through those things, and you got this thing, and it always felt like that the road was, my camper was this wide and the road was this wide. And so I have to be very, very, very careful. And that's what, on this narrow road that God has called us to, we have to be careful. We have to pay attention. It's not something that we can put on cruise control and just, wander around from lane to lane wherever we want to go. That's why he says, I want you on that narrow path. He calls us to be faithful. And so Matthew 7:3, Yeshua said, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and those who enter through it are many. That's the way that it is with people. That wide road is a road that people go through, but he calls us to go through the narrow road. But it's not a problem, because why? Because he's got his angel going before us and leading us. And, I don't know if any of you have ever had any dealings with angelic beings. Our family has had several. And the Lord has allowed me to see out there at my front gate that he's got an angel protecting us at our front gate. I've seen it. About that quick. But it was that's what God allowed me to see one time, because there were some things going on in the neighborhood and around and so forth, and we were a little concerned. God said, "Don't worry, I got you covered." And tell you what, the angel that I saw standing at my front gate. Many of you have seen my front gate there on the ranch. The gate posts are about this high. Well, the angel was standing there with his sword, and his sword went from the ground to the top of that gate post. His sword itself was over 6 feet tall. And so I thought, I think he's got it covered. I don't have to worry about this. Now, I wish the angel would chase off some of the feral hogs once in a while, but he said, not my job. So, that's, but God protects us. He's got an angel ahead of us. Each and every one of you have God's Spirit ahead of you. So you don't have to worry. Just follow what he wants you to do. And you get I've heard people say, well, I don't know what to do. All the doors seem to be closing. I said, well, if the doors are all closed, then just stand out in the hall and pray until one of them opens up. And don't try to kick any of them down. And that's what you need to do. And just keep in prayer, keep in the Word, and meditation, and being with your fellow believers, and talk about the Lord. In Jewish teaching and thought, it's if you have a meal and you don't discuss Torah, then that meal was worthless. You always, and you have a meal, you should always discuss Torah somewhere along the line. Keep your conversation rooted on the things of the Lord, and it'll go a long way toward leading and guiding you. Could we stand? We'll finish off. Father, we thank you that you are leading us, that you sent your angel, Yeshua, ahead of us back 3,500 years ago, and you're still leading us today.